The time is now 3 p.m., December 18th. I'd like to call this council meeting to order. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to remind everyone that our meetings are web streamed and televised. For those in attendance, I would ask that you ensure that your phones are on silent mode. Unfortunately, we don't have a camera volunteer this evening, so if there's anybody out there watching tonight, we are looking for volunteers. First, the agenda is before you. Are there any changes? My apologies. Okay, so I have a motion here that the agenda be approved as presented, as moved by Councillor Huffman and seconded by Councillor Taylor. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Next, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, my apologies. Do you have consent items? Okay. Seeing none, we're beginning with a presentation this evening on development charges. Mr. Johnson, will you please introduce the matter to council?
Thank you. We have a representative from Watson Associates, and he will be doing a presentation on development charges. We started this study, I believe, this spring of 2018 as a result of a report to council the year before. We had a comprehensive reserve fund report, and one of the recommendations from that report was to have a development charge study prior to our 5-year timeline. It was thought at the time that there were numerous projects that were not identified in the original bylaw, and in order to take advantage of the Development Charges Act, we decided to have a study done this year, and as a result, we have some preliminary results. And one thing to note is at the end of the presentation today, we need to decide whether we post the preliminary results on the website before the end of the year. And if we don't do that, and Andrew will explain that in more detail, but if we don't do that, basically we have to start all over again. And we don't want to do that. However, just to let council know, posting it over the next week or so, it's a preliminary information to the public only. We do make the final decision in the spring of 2019, and Andrew will explain a little bit further the timeline between now and hopefully July 2019. So with that, I will turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to present to you today. I'm not sure about working the presentation. Is there a remote or? Sure, that'd be great. Okay, well, thank you. So, again, it's a pleasure to be here to present to you today on this matter. As Mr. Johnson mentioned, our firm's been retained since the spring of this year to commence with the development charges background study. And the intent of the presentation today is to provide you with a bit of an overview of the legislation, the process that's required, that municipalities in Ontario have to follow in this regard to provide context for the preliminary findings, and then wanted to highlight those findings for you as well after providing those introductory comments, and to focus on the process going forward into 2019 to consider adopting a new bylaw. So you'll see on page 2 of the presentation document the PowerPoint slide entitled Development Charges. So generally what development charges are is a discretionary tool that council has to recover growth-related costs of capital that are required as a result of the increase in need for service resulting from new development. And so the general philosophy behind development charges is that if there is a sufficient level of service in a municipality today, and the capital infrastructure that you have is sufficiently providing that to your existing residents, and new development will demand increases in those services, and you will have to expand infrastructure, whether that's in the form of widening of roads, additional capacity of water and sewer, soft infrastructure in the way of facility space and equipment, then those costs should be borne by those new developments and not paid for by existing taxpayers. And so development charges is that mechanism that councils have to seek to recover those expansionary or incremental costs from new development. And what it looks at is not only the costs of new residential development on the system, but also non-residential forms. And so in reference to non-residential, what we're referring to is those commercial, industrial, institutional types of developments that would also have demands on those services. And when we look at those demands of new development, they sort of come in two forms in the way that the capital costs can be recovered by municipalities. You have the local infrastructure, which the Act refers to as local services. So this is the internal infrastructure to a subdivision as an example, the internal roads, the internal water and sewer network that they're installing. And those are conditions of the development agreements, and developers are typically in placing those at their cost exclusively. And so while those are being directly funded by those contributions or those installations, you will not find those costs in a DC background study and then correspondingly in the charge itself. What the development charge is seeking to recover is the broader infrastructure that knits those developments together. So if you need additional plant capacity, if you need additional distribution and collection systems to connect those systems, if you need broader widening of your road networks, for example, those are the types of costs of capital that you would commonly see in a DC background study and therefore collected through this mechanism. And so the mechanism that the municipalities have to recover these costs is to pass a bylaw under the authority of the Development Charges Act. The Development Charges Act is fairly prescriptive, and we're going to go through that in a moment in terms of the prescribed methodology that has to be adhered to. And what that act requires of municipalities is that when you pass these bylaws have a term of 5 years. And so for municipalities to continue to recover these costs at the end of that term, you have to prepare a detailed DC background study in accordance with the requirements of the Act. You need to go through a public process of council to pass that bylaw and a corresponding appeal process as well. And once that bylaw is passed and adopted, that sets the fees and the governance of those charges. Those monies are then collected from new development as it occurs, typically at the time of building permit issuance. You recover those monies from that revenue source. They go into dedicated reserve funds to be used for those capital purposes only. And so again, it's fairly prescriptive in that regard. Mr. Johnson made some reference to the public process. And so every 5 years, municipalities having to prepare this DC background study. Before you can pass that bylaw, what council has to do is it has to make that study available to the public on your website at least 60 days before you consider passing a new bylaw. It also requires that you hold at least one public meeting. that you provide public notice of that meeting in a newspaper at least 20 days before the public meeting actually occurs, that you allow anyone to speak at the public meeting in that regard, so council can give weight and consideration to those comments. And then after that public meeting, again, as long as it's within that 60-day period that you've had the study available, council can then pass the new bylaw for those charges to come into effect. Once that bylaw is passed, you then have a 40-day period in which anyone can appeal those charges to LPAT, which was formerly Ontario Municipal Board. And if that happens, that doesn't prevent you from imposing the charges. You continue to impose them as per the bylaw. If that was to go through to a hearing, if that hearing was unsuccessful and the board ordered refunds because the charge was felt to be too high, you would issue those refunds to anybody who's paid up until the point that bylaw has been amended by the board. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview and a reason why your municipality and the majority of municipalities in this province are going through this process now, because typically everybody's on the same 5-year rotating basis. And so what we wanted to highlight, at least at the start of the process today, is to review this methodology that's prescribed under the Act. And the reason why it's important to note the methodology is because if there are areas of appeal, it's typically in response to how the municipalities adhered to the methodology, the assumptions that you've made within that methodology to determine those charges. And so you'll see on page 4 of the presentation document, there's an illustration that summarizes the methodology that all municipalities who want to elect to use this tool to impose these types of charges must follow. And so because we are looking at measuring the increase in need for service related to new development, the first step in this process is what is that anticipated development that we expect to see here in the county over prescribed periods of time. And we'll go through this in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides, but this is just to sort of put this in context for you. And so having identified that and having a basis for that rooted in the municipality's growth forecasts or official plan projections is providing that expression of council as to how you anticipate your municipality developing over the longer term. Once that's been established, then progressing down in this illustration, we then need to measure on a service-by-service basis which of these services do we feel will be impacted by this increase in development or this change in development. You'll note there that there are some services that, even though they may be impacted by development, under the Act are ineligible to be included for recovery in a development charges bylaw. And again, we'll touch on all these in a little bit more detail in a moment. So the needs assessment component, which is this first part of the methodology, the Act requires that we must measure what that increase in need is on a service-by-service basis, and that there are a couple of tests that we have to adhere to in terms of measuring that. Firstly, we must make sure that there's an expression of council with respect to that need. So it's not ourselves or working with municipal staff, our position or our place in this exercise to create a wish list of capital needs that we think would be nice for the municipality to in place. We're looking at expressions of council to provide us with that guidance. And so typically we're looking at your previous DC background study that was prepared 5 years ago, in that sometimes those needs are being carried over because we are looking at needs over a longer term horizon, 10 years and sometimes longer. We're looking at updates in terms of master plans that are looking at the demands of service in your municipality over those longer terms. We're looking at your capital budget and forecasts that you're providing. So we're using all of those as this expression of council in terms of those needs. We also need to measure those needs relative to the historic level of service you provided historically over the last 10 years. And the reason for that is the intention of the Act is to seek to recover these costs of service where you are extending your current levels of service for the demands of future development. If you are improving your level of service because there's a regulatory requirement, because there may be a deficiency, those improvements under the Act are not considered to be growth related. So we're only entitled or limited to under the Act by this historic level of service that you've provided in your municipality over the last 10 years. The one notable change to that requirement when we look at the illustration is with respect to transit. And so this act was amended in 2016. With respect to transit services, it's no longer restricted by this historic level of service view, but it's restricted by what your planned level of service would be. So it has more of a forward-looking perspective in that regard. So now that we've established what those needs are, then what we need to do under the Act is we need to look at what are the specific capital projects that we feel at this point in time would support that increase in demand for service and therefore that increase in need. And so that's where we are looking for specific capital projects to identify those capital costs and when we think they may occur within that forecast period. There's a number of deductions that you'll see highlighted in orange in the far right-hand side of that illustration. These are the statutory deductions that we have to consider as part of preparing this background study under the Act. And so you'll see them noted there, and again, we'll touch on this in a bit more detail. Is there any uncommitted excess capacity that is available within those projects that should be deducted? Is there a benefit to the existing community related to those projects that should be deducted? Do you anticipate receiving any grants, subsidies, or contributions towards those projects? They need to be considered and deducted as well. And then finally, there's something called a 10% statutory deduction that applies on soft services that we need to account for. And so once we've made those deductions to the specific capital projects, that then provides us with this forecast of growth-related capital expenditures that this municipality would anticipate incurring over the forecast period that forms the basis of the charge. And then there's a number of policy issues related to how you choose to impose those, whether you choose to impose those across all eligible types of development, whether you wish to seek to reduce or exempt certain types of development entirely or partially for economic development or social policy reasons. Those are entirely within council's jurisdiction to do so, and other policies that would dictate how that bylaw would be implemented. So that's a brief illustration of what needs to be followed. And again, hearkening back to my earlier comments, when we do see appeals with respect to these bylaws and background studies, it's these elements of this methodology that are typically the objections of those appeals. And so as we continue on through the presentation, I just wanted to step through each of those in a bit more detail in reference to that overview. So the first item with respect to development on page 5, as I mentioned earlier, this is the sort of context for the undertaking is what does council anticipate that amount, type, and location of development to be over the prescribed periods of time, because this is also going to inform how we measure that increase in need for service on a service-by-service basis. And what we know under the Act is that there are certain services that do not have a limitation, and we can look at a long-term forecast period. And so in the municipality here, we're looking at the 2014 population and projection study that was prepared by Hemson that looks at your anticipated development across the county to 2041. And we can use that longer term planning horizon for hard services under the Act that are defined as being water, wastewater, stormwater services, fire, and police. But all other services, if we're looking at parks or recreation or library, they're all limited to a 10-year forecast period for the purposes of this exercise. And so having looked at that and identified what that anticipated development is, then as I've mentioned, we need to assess what the increase in need for services are. And so on the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain services that may have growth-related cost requirements in terms of their demands for increase in need for service, but under the Act, we cannot include them in a development charge. And so what those include are, we cannot include headquarter space for the general administration of a municipality. So if you were going to expand town hall because you needed additional space for the general administration of governance or finance or human resources, for example, that expansionary space could not be a capital cost included in a DC. We also could not include arts or cultural or entertainment facilities. So this does not include recreation centers or community centers or libraries, but it would include things like performing arts centers, art galleries, museums. Those cannot be included in a development charge. Tourist facilities, whether those are convention centers, tourist information centers, for example, those cannot be included in the development charge. If you were seeking to make capital contributions towards hospitals, that cannot be included in a development charge. And then lastly, as amended in 2016, historically you were unable to include any solid waste services in a development charge. Now you're only limited to including waste diversion capital. And so if there is any landfill or incineration capital requirements, those also cannot be included in a DC. But excluding those, any other potential service you have that we can show that there's an increase in need and therefore a corresponding capital cost requirement that's related to development, they can be considered for a DC and to be included in a DC. The only limitations within those services is that we cannot include computer hardware. They cannot be a capital cost in a DC. And if we are going to include any vehicles, they have to have a useful life of at least 7 years to qualify for inclusion. So having adhered to that, we then must, on a service-by-service basis, measure this increase for service. Again, as you'll see on page 7, it identifies that we need to do that on a service-by-service basis, not necessarily on a project-by-project basis. It's a bit of a higher test in that regard. As I mentioned earlier, when we are looking at that increase in need, if we measure that to be $10 million over the forecast period, for example, we have to compare that to the average level of service you've invested over the prior 10 years to see if there's any limitations on recovering that full amount. And so that historic level of service test has to be met. As I mentioned, we need to make sure that that need is rooted in council's expression. And in addition to looking at those capital costs, we also need to measure what the impacts of that capital program will be on the operating budget as well, and that comprises a schedule in the background study. Another addition that was added in the 2016 amendment to the Act was now we also need to include an asset management plan. And the test of that asset management plan is that for the capital projects that we'll be including in the background study, we need to demonstrate that they're sustainable over their life cycle once they're in place. It's a bit more onerous in terms of transit in that it has to be more, it's more prescriptive in looking at not just the assets in the background study, but also those that are currently in service and their life cycle, and much more in line with the 2012 asset management plan guidelines that the province set forward. So having assessed what those needs are and meeting those tests, on the next slide what you'll see is we then need to estimate what these capital costs are. And so the Act is pretty clear on what can be considered a capital cost. And so you'll see on slide 8 that it obviously would include the acquisition of capital assets or the construction of capital assets that you would own, but you can also include the leased costs of capital assets if you have a capital obligation under that lease arrangement. So it provides for that. It also allows you to include the cost of land. So if you need to acquire land as a result of having to construct these additional works, those land costs are also eligible to be included as a capital cost for recovery. The only exception to that is we cannot include the land of parks. We can include the cost to develop a park, to emplace the amenities, whether that's playground equipment, ball diamonds, but the actual acquisition of land itself, we cannot include in a DC because you have that authority under the Planning Act. Also, if we're making any improvements to the land, whether that's landscaping, parking, and the like, those can be included, as well as any furnishings or equipment related to potentially to those facilities. If there are rolling stock requirements in terms of additional vehicles or equipment, those can also be included as eligible costs. And with respect to libraries, you can also include not just the physical costs of the facilities and furnishings, but the collection materials within those buildings that you would require to maintain your existing level of service. And in addition to those sort of hard costs of capital, what you can also include is if you require any studies that are related to those capital assets. So if we need to undertake an EA study for the purposes of that capital project, those EA costs can be included. If we're undertaking master plans that are going to determine what those future capital needs would be, those can be included. We can also include not only the cost of the DC background study itself, but any costs related to its preparation as well. So if we have to update an official plan, update zoning bylaws, for example, if there are capital consulting costs related to those, a portion of those can be funded and included in a DC. And then finally, not only the principal costs of those capital assets can be included in a DC, but also interest costs. So if the municipality, recognizing that you may be installing some of this hard infrastructure for water and wastewater as an example, today to be able to service growth for the next 20, 25 years, you may have to issue debt to be able to provide that. The development charges allows you not only to recover the principal cost of that asset, but also any interest costs associated with it as well. So having then, harkening back to that, that illustration earlier, now that we've determined what those specific capital projects are, there were those statutory deductions that we have to have account for. And so you'll see those starting on page 9. The first is the Act precludes municipalities from recovering what they would refer to as sunk costs of excess capacity. And so what that means is, for example, if you had a water treatment plant that was constructed 30 years ago, and it had sufficient capacity available in it today to service new development. Unless council 30 years ago provided a clear expression that that oversized capacity would be recovered from future development charges, you cannot include that excess capacity in the development charge, right? So it's typically less of an issue in municipalities because we've had a long history of development charges, and usually when you're providing that expanded capacity, council's doing so through a DC, and you can continue to recover those in subsequent bylaws in the future. The next deduction on page 10, benefit to existing, is one that's a bit more considerable in municipalities. And so again, if you refer back to the earlier comments around the intention of development charges, it is to maintain a level of service for the demands of future development. And so if you are constructing a new facility because an existing facility is deficient, that would not be considered growth related. It would be considered a benefit to existing because you're enhancing an existing level of service, for example. However, if you were going to say, based on the demands that we have an existing library, we need to provide additional space, and so we're going to expand that facility. But instead of just adding on to what we have, we're going to demolish what we have and replace it with something bigger. Then the expansionary component of that is growth related and can be included in a DC. The area being replaced would be a benefit to existing as a deduction. Similarly, if we had a road, and because of increased traffic on a road, we'd have to widen that road. The expansion of that road is growth related, but the resurfacing of what's currently there is a benefit to existing, because if you never undertook the expansion because of growth, you would have had to maintain that over its life cycle, as an example. And so when that background study is released, you'll see every specific project with those determinations that have been made in the calculation. As I've also mentioned, another deduction that we have to have account for is any grants, subsidies, or contributions. So you'll see that on page 11. And so what the Act requires is that if you reasonably anticipate receiving any grants, subsidies, or contributions, whether it's in the form of fundraising or the like, unless the grantor has stipulated that you cannot use those funds for DC or growth purposes, you have to apply it proportionally across the project as you've determined its benefit. So basically meaning you need to deduct it first. So if you have a project and it's $1 million project and you're going to receive 50% grant funding, you need to deduct that first. You have the 500,000 remaining for that project, and then however you determine the share to be growth related, that's the portion you would take from the DC after you've applied that grant. The only time you have discretion to apply the grant only to the tax-based share or the benefit to existing share is, again, if the grantor specifies you can't use it for growth purposes, or if it's for a program and not a specific project, like gas tax, for example. And then finally, the last deduction that I mentioned earlier is this 10% statutory deduction for soft services. And so what the Act requires is that once we've determined these costs on a project-by-project basis, and we've made these determinations around benefit to existing grants and the like, we then need to take a further 10% deduction for all of the soft services. And the Act defines a soft service as being anything that's not included on slide 12, meaning water, wastewater, storm, roads and related public works, fire, police, and transit. So if we're including costs related to parks, to recreation, to library, for example, those all require this 10% deduction that needs to be funded by a non-DC source. So that, going through that, back to the earlier illustration, that provides us with what those capital needs are that are then going to underlie this charge that we're seeking to impose on new development. One of the considerations under the Act, as you'll see on page 13, is municipalities have discretion to either impose those charges on a uniform municipal-wide basis or on a more narrow basis to specific areas within a municipality. So for example, in your practice today, which is consistent with what we would generally see across the province, is that all of your services other than water and wastewater would be imposed on a county-wide basis, reflecting that they're uniformly provided and available across the entirety of the county for those that require them. Your water and wastewater services, however, would be considered to be area specific because they're limited only to the urban serviced area. You would not impose water and wastewater DCs in a private service rural area of the county that does not require those services when they develop. And so we must consider whether we are going to use area specifics or uniform charges as part of the background study and part of that public process. And obviously there's pros and cons related to that, whether that's from an administrative purpose or an economic development purpose across the county, or whether that's related to transitioning from what was maybe more of a uniform approach historically to an area-specific approach if that was sought going forward. And so those are all considerations that you would be mindful of in how you would implement those charges. And then lastly, just on the methodological point, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to calculating the charge after going through this process and determining how it will be imposed, there are a number of policies that council must give consideration to, and the Act refers to this as the rules for governing these charges. And so in the bylaw, it would identify at what point in that development process would you calculate and collect those charges. The default mechanism under the Act is that they're imposed at the time of building permit issuance, which is fairly common. You have the ability to recover some harder services like water, sewer, and roads at the time of subdivision agreement, although sometimes that becomes a bit more difficult to administer and to determine given where those applications are in that process, and also the impacts that may have on the development community. Also, there are exemptions provided under the Development Charges Act, and so typically it takes two forms. There are statutory exemptions that all municipalities have to witness. So for example, these charges you would not impose on yourselves or other levels of municipal government if you were constructing a facility in your municipality. You also wouldn't impose these on a school board as well because they're statutorily exempt. If you were to decide to impose charges on industrial development, the Act says that if you have an existing industrial building, they can expand up to 50% of their current floor area and they would not draw a development charge under the Act, as an example. So there are these statutory exemptions that all municipalities have to witness. Beyond that, there are what we refer to as these non-statutory exemptions, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. And those are entirely within your jurisdiction to determine whether or not you want to maintain those exemptions fully or partially, whether you would want to remove them, whether you would want to add to them. That's entirely up to council to make that determination as part of passing your bylaw through that public process. The thing to bear in mind, however, is that, as we've mentioned earlier, these charges are calculated going through this methodology of determining what those costs are, either on a per dwelling unit basis or on a per square foot basis for new development of non-residential. If council elects not to use that tool to recover that cost, you can't take that foregone revenue and increase the charges on other types. That's a cost you'd have to fund from a non-DC source or predominantly from taxes or user fees. So for example, your current bylaw today exempts industrial, right? So if you have new industrial development in the county, they do not pay development charges. That's not uncommon in some municipalities for economic development interests, for the fiscal benefits and other spin-off benefits that you would get from industrial development in your community. However, if you elect to do that and a permit comes forward for industrial, then you're foregoing that revenue, and that money needs to come from another source into the DC Reserve Fund to be able to fund those projects. You can't take that foregone revenue and just say we're going to increase the residential charges to account for it. So it's something just to bear in mind. There are also other provisions in terms of credits. In some cases, municipalities will enter into agreements with developers to have them construct works on your behalf to facilitate their development. If those works are in a development charges background study, the agreement would just specify that you've in essence prepaid those by constructing them, and you wouldn't have to pay DCs up to that amount that you've constructed until that's exhausted. You also will be giving consideration to things like your non-residential charge structure, whether you want to have a uniform non-residential rate, whether you want to differentiate your rate between industrial and non-industrial uses, for example. Council will also give consideration to the charges that we'll talk about in a moment. If you elect not to impose those when the new bylaw is passed, if you identify that you want to phase that in over a period of time, it's entirely within your prerogative to do that. And so these are the types of transition policies that you may consider as part of going through this public process and adoption. And then finally, the charges that you see presented here and that we'll again see in the background study in the subsequent public process are denominated in current dollars today. The Act allows those charges to be indexed in accordance with the StatsCan Construction Price Statistics Index on an annual basis to make sure that they keep pace with capital cost inflation, because this is a bylaw that will be in effect for a 5-year term unless council seeks to rescind it. So that is an overview of the requirements of the Act and the methodology that we have to adhere to provide you with some context. What we wanted to do is to provide you with, as Mr. Johnson mentioned, the preliminary findings of where we are at currently today. Our intention is to file the detailed background study underlying these calculations that would include all of the materials that we've talked about and that we've prepared with staff since the spring, and to have that available on your website before the end of the year, to then allow us to move into this public process period. And that public process period is pretty lengthy. As we mentioned earlier, your bylaw does not expire until August of 2019. And so you have up until that point to go through the public process, to have dialogue with the industry, to receive feedback, and to make any revisions to these preliminary findings before ultimately considering a new bylaw. And so what you'll see on page 16 is the preliminary calculations. So firstly, what you'll note is we're showing you a comparison of a type of residential development charge. That's for a single detached residential unit, which is the predominant form being built within the county. And then the second table to the right is looking at the charge for a non-residential use, whether that's industrial, commercial, or institutional. You'll note in the tables that there are services that are titled as municipal-wide services. So these are those services that are currently being identified as being imposed uniformly across the county. They include roads and related public works to the roads. They would include additional costs for fire, whether that's in the form of facilities, vehicles, equipment for additional firefighters. The provision for parking services as being off-road parking lot facility, lot spaces. Parks and recreation, the development of parks, the construction of additional indoor recreational facilities, for example, additional library requirements of facilities and collections, administration being those studies that we referred to earlier that can be eligible, included in DCs, ambulance services for those additional assets, and costs of development for future marina services. Those are imposed or currently being suggested to be maintained under your current policy on a uniform countywide basis. Those only elected to be imposed in the urban service area would be for water and wastewater. And so if we look at a total urban area charge today, that unit at the time of building permit would pay $14,052. That would be committed into these reserve funds for those specific works. The current calculations are identifying that that charge would increase by about $3,154. So the total charge would be $17,206, or an increase of about 22%. Similarly, the non-residential charge you see on the right-hand side, your current practice today is to impose a uniform non-residential charge. So what that means is that you would impose this charge on all types of non-residential, whether that's industrial, commercial, or institutional, at the same rate. And so they would all pay $5.79 unless they were exempt under the bylaw from that payment. If we were going to maintain that approach, that charge would increase to $10.33, or an increase of about $4.54, or about 78%, in comparison to the charges you have today, largely being for the purposes of water and wastewater services. You see to the right of that, however, we've also run an alternative calculation which would seek to have a different charge for industrial versus non-industrial, non-industrial being commercial and institutional. The reason for this is that the underlying density of development is different in industrial versus non-industrial, which produces a lower charge and a correspondingly higher charge for non-industrial uses. The benefit of this approach is that if council elected to continue to exempt industrial under these proposed rates, that exemption that you would have to fund from non-DC services would be $6.94 a square foot, as opposed to $10.33 a square foot. So by using that calculation mechanism, you have a lower contribution from non-DC sources if you wish to continue to have that policy of exempting industrial. So to put those charges in a bit of context for you, we've included a survey of some of the surrounding area municipalities that also have development charges. So you'll see on page 17 that there's a comparison, again, for that single detached dwelling unit and what those rates are in other municipalities. You'll note in these bar graphs that it includes not only a lower tier area municipal charge, for yourselves being a single tier municipality would include the charge, but in other municipalities that have split jurisdiction, such as a county, you see the upper tier charge that is imposed by the county and the lower tier charge by the area municipality. So we're looking at a like-to-like comparison of services. What you'll also note is that there are some municipalities that also impose education development charges. So this is school boards using a similar mechanism to recover costs that they need for future school sites and have those recovered from development charges. So this is looking at what is that total cost to a developer of a single detached home in the county and in these other jurisdictions. And so firstly, what I would note is when you look at all of these municipalities are going through the same process that you have, or that you're going through right now, and that these bylaws are all set to expire between the spring and summer of 2019. And so you would expect to see these numbers change, and based on our experience, more likely to see them increase as well. When we look at the only municipality that's already adopted their bylaw is Woodstock, and that being the dark blue shaded area of that graph for Woodstock. The orange area, that's the upper tier charge, the county is currently going through their process. That bylaw is set to expire in June, and a new charge would be brought into force for them as well, or considered by them as well. And so when we look at that approximately $3,000 increase that we identified before, that would see your relative position increasing from where you are currently, a bit higher than that of Haldeman, a couple $1,000s less than Woodstock, more comparable to that of Tilsonburg based on their current rates today, but more comparable to the lower end of the comparators in a range of $12,000 in Haldeman up to $40,000 a unit in the city of Hamilton. When we look at the commercial comparison on the next page, on page 18, again, we see a more pronounced change in position with the charges. If the municipality was considering moving towards maintaining a uniform charge, the charge would increase by $4.59 a square foot, from $5.79 to $10.33, comparable of that with Hamilton, but much higher than that of some of the other municipalities that we've surveyed. If the municipality elected to use the second methodology that had a lower industrial charge and an offsetting higher charge for commercial, you would see that that would be higher than those currently in Hamilton at $13 a square foot. On the next slide, in terms of industrial, again, what we see by comparison to the prior slide is not unlike other municipalities in Tilsonburg and Woodstock, the county currently exempts industrial from payment. So even though you could charge the current rate that you have today, the current bylaw elected to exempt industrial, and so that charge is zero today. If the municipality was going to use the uniform rate, you see that it would be at a level of $10.33, comparable to that of Hamilton and Norwich. And if you elected to use the differentiated rate calculated for industrial, that rate would be $6.94, more comparable to Brantford and the county of Brant and their current rates today. And again, to put that exemption in some context, that $10.33 a square foot based on our current calculations and the estimated amount of industrial development in your forecast is an exemption of about $560,000 a year that would have to be funded from a non-DC source. If you elected to use the other methodology that would have a rate of $6.94, that annual exemption is about $380,000 a year. So again, it's not to say that that is the specific amount you will see having to be budgeted for from a non-DC source every year, but if the development was to occur as per your growth forecast projections, that's the level of support it would require. So that's the preliminary charges, how those charges compare to your current rates, and also some of the other area municipalities. We mentioned earlier about the non-statutory exemptions, and you'll see those identified starting on page 20 of the presentation. So as we've mentioned a few times, the current bylaw exempts industrial entirely. It also provides exemptions for roofed accommodation developments, such as hotels and motels and inns. Temporary structures are not charged development charges, again, in part because they are temporary. Farm buildings are also exempt because of their demands on service are relatively small. Affordable housing units, if they meet qualifications under the bylaw, are also exempt. And places of worship, if they are within the Assessment Act exemptions, are also exempt from payment. On page 21, the bylaw also seeks to exempt parking garages that are devoted specifically to parking purposes. And you'll see that there's exemptions for defined central business districts and for brownfield development up to the cost of their environmental remediation. So that's a summary of the application of that methodology. In terms of next steps in concluding the presentation, what we are proposing is to have the comprehensive DC background study that would have all of the underlying assumptions and calculations and rules for council's consideration drafted in that document, to have that posted on the county's website before the end of the year to allow us to then move into the public consultation phase. What would then occur as being proposed is that over the first quarter of 2019, we would meet with the development industry to present those findings to them as well, to hear their concerns with what's being proposed, and to bring that information back to council for your consideration. We would also then hold a public meeting as required under the Act. It's anticipated that that would occur approximately in April. Again, after that public meeting in April, council would give consideration to what you hear from the public on the matter, and then we're currently considering bringing forward a bylaw for passage on July 1st, or for effect on July 1st. So it would have come into a council for adoption in June. And so that concludes my presentation. I'd happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Grunda, for that presentation. I think just to give everybody an update, if it's okay with you, Mr. Johnson, we'll ask some questions, and then we will handle the staff report after the closure of the public meeting, if that works. Okay. So I'd like to open up the floor to the councillors if you have any questions for Mr. Grunda. Mr. Columbus, or Councillor Columbus?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Andrew, who polices this act?
So the province is obviously the statutory authority for that. The appeal process can be appealed to LPAT, so formerly the Ontario Municipal Board, for hearings. And then there's also complaint systems that are built into the bylaw itself.
Okay, thank you. And going back to this chart on page 16 of your report, so are these the numbers that we're projecting? Currently, it's $14,052 per lot, and it would be going up by $3,154, 22% to $17,206. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councillor Taylor?
Thank you, Mayor Chop. Is a 22% increase normal for a municipality of our size? Thank you.
Councillor Martin?
Thank you, Mayor Chop. Would you say that Woodstock is comparable to Norfolk County? You referenced it quite a bit when we were dealing with the charts.
I think it is one of the comparables. Again, I think when you're looking at the municipalities, sometimes the comparisons are really more driven by what their infrastructure demands are and where they may be in their life cycle. But that's part of why we
I just wondered if we ended up missing some information there because it was on the screen, it was on the slides, but I don't have it here. I don't have Woodstock here in this information. Is that something we could?
Yeah, we can definitely provide that to you. We do it the Woodstock Day one.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hoffman?
Thank you, Mayor Chop. I just wanted to clarify on page 20 that when we're looking at the non-statutory exemptions, that farm help house would refer to bunkhouses. Okay, thank you. I assume so, but I just wanted to double check.